think we're going to start with one of the ones that's the other thing, because I particularly wanted to hear from Jordan on this one. So for people who who know people who may know Jordan a little bit from her previous appearances on this show and from the live shows that that she's put together for us, may not know that she lived for many years in Israel and still knows a lot of people there, all of which is going to have more obvious relevance when we look at the piece that I wanted her to discuss, which is by Lyle Leibovitz. It is called "A Color Revolution in Israel." And this is like, well, let's start off here. So for people who don't spend enough time exposing themselves to this school of thought on the internet, what's somebody want to define a color revolution? What that's supposed to be?
It would be a revolution that is not grassroots, populist, or even domestic or internal to a country, but brought about by a foreign power, I believe.
Yeah, exactly. So, right, the people say color revolution, I think, because they're kind of referring to, was it like there was back in like the early 2000s, there was like mass protests in Iran that people called like the Green Revolution, and then like stuff was happening in Ukraine later when
Maidan, sure, that was regarded by some as a color revolution, although
I think it's also debatable. One of the well, I think all of the actual, like, there are no really, like, all of the examples that inspired it, I think, are super dubious. But anyway, I think one of the iterations of the Ukraine stuff was like the Orange Revolution or something. So I think it's I think the Orange Revolution and the Green Revolution put together gave people the inspiration for this phrase, the Color Revolution. And people who use the phrase, I kind of don't think either of these are really examples, but the people who use the phrase, what they mean by it is like a revolution that's really like it's like a CIA plot or something, that that it's a revolution that's like somehow astroturfed into existence from across the world by like the National Endowment for Democracy.
I think it's fair enough to point to the fact that our institutions have gotten behind and supported certain factions within revolutionary forces, but to say that they are the sole source of them or are funding them, or they weren't actually inspired by any popular movement or dissent within a country, is pretty absurd.
Yeah, exactly. It's not false that dissident movements in one country often receive support from rival powers. That's for sure true. The problem with the way that people talk about color revolutions is that the implication is that, like, when that happens, then there's just no there. That's just like that just means that the rival power just somehow created the revolution, like, all by itself. Which, I mean, really, historically, it's incredibly rare to have revolutions that don't at some stage or another rely on like, that don't take advantage of the interests of other powers and and undermining the power that they're rebelling against. So the United States wouldn't exist if France had under Louis XVI hadn't thought that it was in their interest to provide military support to the U.S. in the War of Independence against Great Britain. The Haitian Revolution, the slave rebels were being supported by the Spanish Empire for their own reasons for a while, to the point that Toussaint Louverture and Dessalines were actually commissioned officers at one point in the Spanish military. Vladimir Lenin famously was allowed passage back into Russia on a German train. This is kind of all over the place all throughout history, because it's really hard to successfully overthrow just about anything And so you have to kind of have a lot of things going for you, and very oftentimes that includes at some point or another some level of support from outside, from like other actors who have their own cynical reasons that are unrelated to what you're doing
Sure.
to what to support you. And I think, and certainly in the 20th century, I mean, like we could look at any number of revolutions and national liberation movements around the world that were, certainly being supported by the Soviet Union. You know, I don't think anybody who uses this color revolution terminology thinks that like the KGB was just like magically willing, these revolutions around the world into existence. So yeah, that'd be my general critique of the concept, the terminology of a color
Sure.
revolution.
One of the
Uh,
commenters here has a good point that I'd like to build on for a second.
yeah,
Disentropic says Wikipedia's description has people using color revolution approvingly as well, and not with the implication that it's fake. And I would say, sure, there's a big difference between that and like a false flag, right? Like this is not something that's meant to be entirely false or just made from whole cloth. Like there is a basis in reality, there is a popular movement, but it wouldn't be as successful, go as far, be as well organized, any of these things without some sort of outside influence or support. And I mean, that's certainly what our friend I like that you called him Lyle Leibovitz. It's like such an anglification of the name. Liel Leibovitz here says more or less that what's happening in Israel at the moment of his writing in late March and still currently, and that was 12 weeks into protests. Now, we're at the end of April.
So yeah, let's just maybe just for like 90 seconds before we start, digging into this, we've got this up because we actually want to sort of go through a lot of the specific claims that are made in here. What is so for people who haven't been following it necessarily, there's in Israel, the government of Bibi Netanyahu has announced a while back this judicial reform to really weaken the check that the courts put on all the horrible stuff that he wants to do, and then just kind of take us through broad brush what happened then.
Sure. Well, there's a few things to note. First of all, as opposed to like the American system, where we have constitutional law based on a constitutional document, which is maybe not something that requires 12 mages. It's still a lot more robust than the Israeli style, which is common law based, because Israel was once a mandate of British colonial power after World War I. So Canada has one like this. There's one that's actually pretty similar in like just Germany in general. Which means that you have several laws which are considered constitutional laws, but there is no constitution in of itself. They were really limited, and the state was planning kind of on building upon it more after 1948, but it sort of never happened, and they kept just going on the common law style of dealing with legal precedent. Eventually, in the 90s, there was already a judicial revolution of sorts, which made some human rights laws codified. They're a bit lackluster, easy enough to twist, say, against Palestinian human rights or just non-Jewish ones, but it was seen as a bit of an improvement, and it gave the Supreme Court a lot more say with regards to upholding other legislation, whether it was constitutionally legal or not. Otherwise, that would fall within the balance of power between legislators and the executive. And what Benjamin Netanyahu, in the latest government of his making, which is seen as and absolutely true to be the most fringe right-wing government of Israel to date, because he really had to lean in his building a parliament based with ultra-religious Jews, religious Zionist Jews who live in the settlements, and just the opposition being the rest of the Democratic part of the country, more or less. They didn't like the fact that a lot of the things that they wanted to push through in legislation would come up against the Supreme Court, which would probably say, hey, this sounds undemocratic, illiberal, not moderate enough, something that we can't allow. So how do you get around that? You say, never mind the Supreme Court. We're going to fix the balance of powers, and we're going to let Parliament, with a simple majority, vote laws through with no veto power, more or less, for the Supreme Court. And it was just going to put a lot more power back into the hands of the executive and the Parliament. This is bad in the case of Israel because of the way it is now, basically, more or less. It's not something that you can be absolutist about. You have to take things in consideration in the context that they exist in. And these people who are currently in power would like to push through laws, which would be terrible not only for your average Israeli citizen, but certainly for those who are uncounted for, who cannot vote, Palestinian people who live in Gaza and in the West Bank, non-Jews, also just non-religious Jews, minority groups. They have really bad plans for everyone. Let's just put it that way. So when Netanyahu was elected and built his ruling power around him with these people, and they floated the idea of a new judicial reform and called it democratic for the sake of a balance of power, everyone kind of smelled the smoke pretty quickly and started to protest. And instead of dying down or coming out of the news cycle, it grew and grew and grew and grew. And by the time that Leah Leibovitz writes this article in March, you had hundreds and thousands of people on the streets in multiple cities all over Israel every weekend, including in Tel Aviv, hundreds of thousands, funnily enough, waving Israeli flags, which is kind of confusing when you consider what's going on. But you see a nice little rainbow flag in there too, and I think he chose that on purpose. So he wants to say that what's happening isn't really democratic because, well, the public voted for Netanyahu, didn't they? They gave him the power to build up his own ruling organization, and here are the people that he chose. So any movement on the ground against that is in and of itself undemocratic. And if it's strong and if it's growing and if it isn't just being put down, then it must mean that there is some outside force at play here. And it's not just about the judicial reform, which expresses the people's will somehow, but about the international order or globalist blob having
So
their own desire.
Anyone who wants to understand what lies in store, not only for the Jewish state, but for much of the West, would do well to look at the clashes bringing Israel to a near standstill, ostensibly over Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's proposed judicial reforms. It's a future in which the democratic will can be hindered and ultimately undone by the tantrums of a local activist class co-opted by the globalist blob, which is fun because, we always joke about that word globalist on this show, and that's a confusing instance, right? That the international globalist conspiracy is trying to is trying to take over Israel. That the international cabal of globalists.
But they're also a local activist class, which is really funny considering that it is Israel itself.
Yeah, that's So that's
the local faction of the international globalist blob.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if it's going to be anywhere, it's going to be in the globalist state. But
I'm glad someone finally said it.
Yeah. So with both sides claiming popular support, it isn't so easy to tell the warring camps apart. He's going to help you.
It is actually. It's pretty easy, but all right, go ahead, Liel. Continue.
One pretty good approximation pits Ashkenazi Jews hailing from European countries against Mizrahi Jews who come from the Middle East and North Africa, roughly speaking.
Wrong. Okay, it is certainly true that there are issues with regards to power structures within Israel being largely dominated by Ashkenazi European Jews, and Mizrahim have been people from the Middle East, from North Africa, wherever you will, Spanish background. People with brown skin, more or less, have been subjugated by Ashkenazi power for a long time. And he's going to go on to point out that the Supreme Court itself is rather white. So this is clearly a deciding factor. But that's not really true with regards to who is on the street and why they are out against the reforms. And no one is complaining that this will be better in order to be a counterbalance against the whiteness of the Supreme Court, except for the people who are in favor of the reforms. And that is absolutely not one of their goals in changing anything either. So that's just something that we can put to bed. Also, the fact that Netanyahu has lost support amongst the ruling class in Israel, which is largely Ashkenazi, but not entirely. And he's had to go and make friends with Shas and other groups like this that are a lot more Mizrahi. In fact, he has a really weird similarity with Trump in a certain way. There's now a group within Israel that says only Bibi, like he is the only leader who is going to be ensuring the security of the state, more or less, not to trust anybody else. And they see him in a way as a man of the people. But the people who see him as a man of the people are from a totally different class, a totally different, like, Jewish ethnic group, who would otherwise be distrustful. He is incredibly wealthy. He's incredibly white himself, and they have nothing in common.
Another attempt at making sense speaks of secular Israelis against religious Jews, which is why anti-government protesters have made a habit of regularly marching into Orthodox neighborhoods and taunting residents.
That doesn't happen, actually. And it's really funny that Liel thinks it does. I don't know what he's basing it on, and he's certainly happily not citing that, but it sounds good to outsiders, right? At the same time, you have to wonder about Compact Magazine. Like, whose side are you going to be on? The extremely religious nationalist sides that live in small enclaves and aren't part of greater society, or the greater democratic part of the country who are less religious and more secular. No one is going into these communities. In fact, if you try to do that, you will be chased out. You will be yelled slurs at, thrown stones at, and it's generally just not a great idea to go into those areas. At the same time, those people are growing those areas and trying to create their own new enclaves within secular society to do something which is generally looked down upon in Judaism, which is more or less proselytizing, trying to bring people into the ranks of religious Zionism. So a little bit backwards there. By the way, I'm like cool and calm reading and going over this now, but more or less this kind of thing that we're doing, this back and forth, was me reading this in real time. Writing to you, to Kuba, to Varn, like, this motherfucker, this is all wrong. How could he possibly? And like, I couldn't understand at the end of it whether he's being willfully ignorant or he's just, lying, or he's that out of touch because he hasn't lived in Israel for a very long time. More on that later. Interesting story about this guy.
Yeah. And it is interesting, that Compact published this because, if Compact published something that was about sort of the set of issues on which I typically think of myself as strongly disagreeing with their editors about, like, domestic American politics, that was like, kind of had something to do with domestic social policy in some way, abortion, increased social acceptance for gay and trans people, stuff like that, then, that, like, and they published something that I, like, horrendously disagreed with about all that, I'd be like, all right, well, fish got to swim, birds got to fly. That's going to happen. But the thing that, one of the areas where I expect them to have good positions is anti-interventionism about foreign policy. And I mean, for as long as I can remember, more or less, every 6 months, Netanyahu has been like begging the United States to like destroy Iran for him, or let him do the same thing.
Sure.
And so this is like this extremely, extremely hawkish, belligerent government of a close U.S. ally that's being defended here. So there's something a little bit funny about that.
I would also be totally remiss if I didn't mention about that last point about the seculars and these communities, and that someone who is a member of Netanyahu's government is incredibly dangerous and incendiary and insightful. In fact, he is known and convicted as a national, like, domestic terrorist. Itamar Ben-Gvir, who did in fact start going into East Jerusalem Palestinian neighborhoods, trying to set up a force to bring more Jews into the neighborhood, to take up not even available homes, but to force people out of their homes there, set aside the West Bank and the occupation. Within East Jerusalem itself, Itamar Ben-Gvir is trying to bring religious Jews into neighborhoods, into direct conflict with the people there. So it's just absolutely disgusting, in my opinion, that Liel can sprinkle this in as if the secular element of Israel are doing things against the upstanding religious Jewish element. It's vile.
Yeah, I mean, again, so beyond the fact that in this case, this article in Compact is, siding with the people that you'd think that the most extreme neocons would be sided with, in a way that, again, is a very weird fit with their general foreign policy views. Like, I understand there's the appeal of finding, traditionalist religious people to side with. I would point out that if you want people who live over there who believe, who are very religious and share your socially conservative values, religious Jews are not the only game in town there. You can, there's this, there are other options. But in any case, there's some stuff about how the salt of the earth deplorables were against the protests. They want a Jewish state, which they believe is predicated on traditional values and isn't merely a carbon copy of Berlin or London or New York. They want a state that is democratic, which they take to mean letting voters, not unelected, unaccountable officials, shape policy. And they want to put these two aforementioned considerations above all other political calculations and power plays.
Liel's never going to, gesture at the fact, not as a leftist, not as a Jew, not as an American, that the concept of having a Jewish and a democratic state is in and of itself entirely contradictory. Right. And one of the funny things that's going on the streets in Israel is that Israelis believe what they are fighting for right now is democracy. And it is true to a degree that these judicial reforms, of course, would lead to the state falling and slipping further into its ultimate fascist tendencies. But this was a trajectory that it was always going to go down, no matter what, just based on that contradiction. So it's really funny, like the whole concept of him thinking that this is like an anti-democratic movement in and of itself, and the people on the ground talking about democracy and nobody talking about the undemocratic, illiberal, issues of human rights in Israel, issues of keeping an entire and huge part of the population outside of the democratic tradition, even if that's just like electoral politics and parliamentary order. No, he's never going to talk about that. Instead, in Tablet Magazine, what he's going to do is publish articles about how Gazans Palestinians in Gaza are dying for photo ops, and that the media is enabling this.
Yeah, the guy Lyle, let's say, is
Lyle,
is a should say
Lyle McLeibovitz.
yes, Lyle McLeibovitz is publishing this particular article in Compact, but he's the editor of Tablet Magazine. That's what Jordan's referring to there. So you don't see them, these salt of the earth, silent majority types, marching in the streets in part because they're much less affluent on average than the typical protester, in part because they don't live in big cities. Not this fast talking big city kind of Israelis.
All those people who don't work on weekends, which is when these things happen in cities all across Israel that aren't big. All right, whatever. Go ahead, Lyle.
But mostly because they believe that if you live in a healthy democracy, you elect the people you like, then give them the time to do what they promise to do. Burning tires on highways, the first choice of the third world, isn't their style.
Oh, that's lovely, isn't it? We love that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's funny that this is like happening concurrently with like the French protests. I saw a lot of tires burning there. Is he saying
France
that France is third world, or maybe just the people who are burning tires within France are from the third world? Like, I don't know, North Africa or something weird.
The blob, on the other hand, is much more visible and much easier to understand. If you've been paying attention to U.S. politics these last 5 years, you already know it well. Nearly every page from American progressive playbook is at work here now. Talk of the right being immoral and therefore illegitimate, check. Insinuations that a much reviled political foe is mentally unstable, a common criminal, or both, check. Cliched theatrics like donning red handmaid's tale capes and marching formation for the cameras, check. And unchecked irony, look what he did there, like describing your every move as peaceful and democratic and grassroots while reporting breathlessly that your foes are violent, authoritarian, and awash in foreign cash and sinister influences, check, check, and to check.
Listen, if you're going to have a legitimate protest, what you have to do is very carefully avoid all cliches. Otherwise, it's just not really worth much, is it? That's easy enough. Yeah. I mean, I remember writing to you something pretty... it really did make me laugh, at least in this part, as though I was not just fuming and furious about the rest of it. But this insinuations of mental health. Right? I mean, clearly he's talking about what people were saying about Trump, correct? But pretty easily, we could say the same things about Biden, and they were. Like, it's very both sides-y, to use a cliche here. Yeah. Mentally unstable. I don't know how many people are saying that about Bibi other than he's like a power-hungry lunatic, but a common criminal... Oh, yeah, he's well under indictment for corruption charges. And not only that, but 2 other of the ministers within his government are criminals. I mean, I said already, one of them domestic terrorist. There's another guy who was actually kicked out of the government already, and they passed a law to try to get him back in, but he said, you know what? Nah, I'll sit this one out. So the fact that we're just like lobbing accusations, they're not really accusations in this case. Those are descriptors that totally fit the situation.
Well,
but yeah, don't do that. Otherwise, we're going to lampoon you.
Especially don't accuse your political enemies of being awash in foreign cash and sinister influences. Hold that thought. The similarities in style and substance aren't a coincidence. They're essential because while the lion's share of the protesters are certain they're participating in a wholesome patriotic feat of civil disobedience, they're actually being inducted, largely unwittingly, into a global order. Says, I mean, whatever. Just to make the subtext text here, it is hilarious to me how much stuff that usually feels like anti-Semitic signaling he's using in this, in this context to talk about the global conspiracy. Into a global order that has little use for the stubborn subtleties of nationalism, faith, or any belief system. Take a look, for example, at what transpired in the aftermath of Netanyahu's recent decision to fire his minister of defense. Israeli universities.
Yoav Gallant, and like this is what triggered like the mass protest, but he's going to totally mischaracterize this, and it's almost not entirely worth going into, but I will say a few words about this.
Sure, go. By all means.
Yes. Okay, so Yoav Gallant, a minister of defense, super right-wing, like in and of himself, but from Bibi's party, Likud, one of his closest allies in a certain way within this government. He got fired for telling Bibi that the response to the proposed judicial reforms by the state security apparatus itself, meaning like lots of members of the army, the IDF, specifically pilots, which is one of the like main strongholds for Israeli supremacy in the area, were going to refuse military service if this was going to happen. Not just military service like 18-year-olds, but reservists. And if we're constantly in an existential crisis and Iran is planning on blowing us off the map at any minute and any given point in time, then you would imagine that the IDF is pretty important, especially with the only Bibi security camp. So Yoav Gallant says, hey, these judicial reforms, although I personally like them and think it's a great idea, are kind of putting us in a situation that is insecure. He didn't say I'm encouraging the pilots to refuse service. I'm just literally the messenger. And he shot the guy. He fired him the same night that he brings this information because, just implying that Bibi is putting the country in any sort of more of an existential crisis that it already is in. And this doesn't just affect, legislation or the government or the people, but actual security. That was just a step too far. So he fired him, one of his own close allies, and that was just a huge, red flag for the entirety of society. And that's when they really started coming out in full force in demonstrations and protests. So that's what that little shtick is about.
The Israeli universities quickly announced collectively that they're going on strike, trampling free and unfettered exchange of ideas and diversity of opinion alike under the jackboot of conformity. Want to bring in Jake here because for his perspective as a CWA organizer on this description of universities going on strike, that if a university, okay, I guess the thinking here is that if there's a strike at a university, that means the university is shut down, which means that the free and unfettered exchange of opinions and diversity of opinion isn't happening. Therefore, those things are being trampled under a jackboot.
Yeah, I see where the logic's coming from, but I feel like it just feels like a bit of a major stretch.
Really?
Especially because they, are trying, I think, to go on strike to preserve the rights of citizens, right? And probably
students and educators are just elites in training.
I mean, it's kind of a classic anti-labor argument that if if the garbage workers go on strike, for example, then they're damning the consumers when the students are really the consumers here. Not really thinking that maybe like the working class people that the garbage people are delivering to and the students themselves, maybe that there's a united cause at play. It's kind of just a really reductive argument, I would think. And also I was thinking it was kind of funny on the the whole playbook thing. It's like all of they're like, it's the same playbook, calling the main guy at the top corrupt, and it's like, well, if they both happen to be corrupt, then wouldn't that what you're saying only
when have
makes
I
sense.
heard this one before?
Yeah, like one other time.
All right, so there's some description we're skipping past about all these massive strikes and protests that showed that that showed that everything was happening in lockstep. It says this level of lockstep isn't a rare occurrence, a pro-political synergy indicating a broad and wholesome consensus of we the people. It's just another manifestation of what happens when a society as powerful and privileged classes band together, hold everyone else hostage, and use their control of top-down information systems to generate mobs. Feel like that sentence started and ended in very different places. We saw it in the United States when American cities were burning in the aftermath of George Floyd's killing.
Whole
while the-
city's burning down. What did they
Yeah.
do?
It was just a
Terrible.
Wendy's.
They lit too many tires, I guess. Is that how that happened? I don't know.
Yeah, well, actually, I was just talking with Jordan, I think, about Meghan McCain for some reason, and the other night, and I was remembering my all-time favorite thing in 2020 when Meghan McCain tweeted this thing about like New York is like a war zone and it's like the city is in flames or whatever, and there was this I think producer for like Samantha Bee who quote tweeted it was like, Megan, we live in the same building. I just went outside, it's fine.
That is so funny.
And Megan treated this as she actually said she had to leave New York because of this, because she was essentially being doxxed, even though the only information that was conveyed by this is that
there's the only one building that I know of in New York that has a doorman and an entrance. So
yeah, exactly. It's
like she was in trouble.
Nothing in the tweet said what building it was. It's just that they both lived in the same building and it was in New York. But that's being doxxed and Meghan McCain's understanding of things. Yeah, so I mean, again, it just seems like Mr. McLeavitz wants to have it both ways here, because on the one hand, he wants to talk about how actually this stuff isn't really the people, it's really the insidious elites, the activist class, the globalists. But so on the other hand, he wants to fret about mobs like a nervous French aristocrat.
Totally. It's amazing. Yeah. Yeah, he said something. I went to go see his Twitter profile, and he was really kind of just ripped apart for this one, as you might imagine, by all different types of groups, not just the leftists that they're trying to stir up here, but American Jews, Zionists, people who care about this stuff in general, or just calling him out for like the weird use of globalist blob and other strange dog whistles coming from an Israeli guy. But he said something really funny, and you mentioned this having it both ways. Try to figure out what he's saying. This was his most recent tweet on the matter that I could find. Watching the protests in Israel, one thing is clear. One side has real, unconditional love for other Jews and the Jewish state, and the other is willing to burn down absolutely everything for absolute political power. I have no doubt which side will prevail.
So it sounds like he has a lot of unconditional love for the
Which
side.
Which side, Leo?
For both
Who
sides.
are you talking about? Because
for both sides.
I mean, that's like kind of more or less exactly the claim on the side of the protesters, that like with an absolute lust for power, there is one group that's willing to burn it all down, and that group tends to have people in its government that don't have a lot of love for all Jews or the Jewish state, if you will. He's talking about protesters, right? I think, but he doesn't come out and say it. And that's the really funny thing about this article as well, is he won't say that like the protesters themselves are wrong. They're just being driven by outside forces, and the good, dear people who stay at home, they may or may not have an opinion on all of this. They could be for or against. He doesn't really say what's wrong with the government. Doesn't really say what's right with it either. So I just find it amazing and cowardly, the stance that he's taken in this entire thing, and afterward. Good job, Liel. Brilliant stuff. Really commend you.
What might the global coal mine look like in the not so distant future? I think there's a just on a writing level. I mean, I get that he's trying to say a canary in the coal mine thing, but I don't think it quite works. Like I think this sentence actually needs some work. But anyway,
There are a few like that in here, yeah. But if you say that, your buddy, the editor of this magazine, might get mad. I saw that in a little conversation people had. The first line is also a little bit like, what? But anyway, never mind that. Editing, schmediting.
Americans have enough homemade political dramas to pay much attention to the kerfuffles raging overseas. But that is a little bit of a mess.
Wait, Americans have enough homemade political. They have too much homemade political dramas.
That would already be better. Yes.
Yeah.
Listen, if you guys are making those faces, that's good enough for me to prove my point.
No, yeah, that's not. Wait, I think it's actually wrong. I think because it would be they have it. It implies that you need more. Okay, we're showing which grad program I'm in right now by the fact that I got most amped up about this sentence that makes no sense. Anyway,
I'm just saying we've got some political disagreements, but if you are hiring for more line editing, there is a pool of talent here you could draw from.
Listen, if Lionel, if you need a personal copy editor, Lionel Leibovitz. No, not me.
Yeah. You're not going to clean up Kyle's prose.
Bummer.
All right.
Something about canaries, and there are probably coal mines that they're in. I don't know. Or rather, the coal mines, and we're just imagining canaries. We don't need the canaries anymore. We have better technology than birds. That's bad. PETA's going to come after you if you say anything about the canary.
I see.
Has a clear vision. No sooner had the protest started than a gaggle of Israelis planted themselves firmly across the street from the American consulate in Tel Aviv, demanding that President Biden intervene as if appealing to a foreign power to adjudicate domestic political disputes were the norm. This man is very upset at the thought that the United States would take any sort of interest in what happens in Israel, which would be unprecedented. And I, for one, am with him. I think that it is appalling that the United States would take some sort of interest in Israel's internal affairs. I think cutting off. I think no longer funding the Israeli state might be a good first step towards preventing the possibility of such influence. Just a suggestion. But the American ambassador, Tom Nides, I don't know how to say that. Anyway, seemed to have heard the call, taking unprecedented liberties, and commented on Netanyahu's actions and prospects. The idea that the United States would comment on something going on in another country, I just don't know what to come to.
Excuse me. Have you ever heard of the phrase "stay in your lane," statesmen of the world? This is not for you to get involved in. State Department? What is it that you do? Anyway, never mind. Carry on.
Cuckoo. They coo.
They do coup, but they certainly should not make statements about other countries.
I mean, a quiet military coup between friends is one thing, but I mean, like, making a public comment is a little gauche.
Well, actually, the really funny thing about all of this is that the State Department had to make a comment because Bibi Netanyahu's son, Yair Netanyahu, was tweeting basically the entire premise of this article about a month before it was even written, but in Breitbart, where he was claiming that the protests in the street against his father were State Department plants, a color revolution. In fact, I think that Breitbart even used color revolution, and just simply on the fact that this was the prime minister's son and he's spreading disinformation, the State Department felt moved to put out an official statement repudiating Yair Netanyahu and saying, actually, we really have no hand in any of this. Thank you very
Well,
much.
you say that, but next sentence, add the fact that the State Department has provided funding to at least one of the major NGOs organizing the protests, and you understand why some in Israel are speaking out about the recent wave of unrest as just another U.S.-sponsored color revolution.
That's crazy, because you would assume that it must be, Obama who was one of the first to openly say words against Israel, or Biden, who is currently in control of the State Department. But that funding actually started under Trump. Huge fan of Israel, moved the American embassy to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv, blah, blah, blah. And the thing that they're funding actually is not a group that starts undemocratic riots, tire burning, whatever you like. They spread Zionistic democratic propaganda within the Israeli school system, so little kids will feel good about having to go into the army or whatever, and keep this stuff up.
Don't think we're talking about a tremendous amount of money, but
that's also true. And it's certainly not being funneled into, I don't know what, printing enormously large Israeli flags for people to wave around on the street. I'll tell you what, insider fact, all of the planning that's going on has been happening on WhatsApp and Telegram. Kind of average. Nothing pretty.
The reality, however, is more complex than that. Oh, that's good. The blob, as Americans alive during the last 6 years already know, has no use for half measures. It exists simply to swallow up its enemies and everything they hold dear. And its zeal to bring down not only the reviled Netanyahu, but the bearded weirdos who support him.
Bearded weirdos. That's good.
And who spend their days on antiquated trifles like the Torah. The blob annihilated the Israeli democratic process in their entirety. Why, after all, risk your life to serve in the army when its senior leadership has just made it clear that service is conditional on the right people being in power?
That's interesting as well, because Netanyahu, who comes from like a sort of dynastic line almost of people of import in the government and in specifically the army, his brother and father decided to refuse service during the disengagement in Gaza because the people in power at the time were doing bad things by freeing Palestinians unilaterally in Gaza. I mean, that turned out great, but also your brother and dad, and well, his brother died. The other brother and his father did the exact same thing that Netanyahu has said is disgraceful, immoral, treacherous, and what Liel is claiming here is really the problem with the whole thing, which is the funny part, that's kind of what Gallant was pointing at being problematic for security. But never mind, that's all too nuanced. And, he said the word here, complex, once, but he's not really into that.
And it even seems like in that line, it kind of sounds like he's advocating refusing service in the future, or saying that would be okay. Which is all very confusing. But the story of Israel's upheaval is still unfolding. It's much too soon to tell how it's going to end. But two things ought to be urgently clear. First, for every Israeli ambling about, dressed as characters from a TV show, is really fixated on this. We know how many people were doing the Handmaid's Tale thing. Anyway, there's another hold up at home, heartbreaking and outraged. Determined to stop this madness. Well, if they're determined to stop the madness, I don't know why they're at home. Gotta, look, nobody's gonna stop madness for you. You gotta get out of the home if you want to stop madness.
I am going to stop this madness by being incredibly sane on my couch.
Determined, yet realize the democratic means the once suffice no longer applies. So why are they at home? And second, that their struggle isn't theirs alone. It's one shared by all who wish to exercise democracy in its purest, simplest form, namely the right to live freely according to one's own beliefs, free from harassment and control. Palestinians have entered the chat. America once fought a bitter war to break away from the yoke of monarchs uninterested in the consent of the governed. That was a transition. Israel's true Democrats are doing the same now, and they need all the sympathy and support they can get.
True Democrats sit on their couch until they are called to go to elections, which might happen like a lot if BB's in power or different, elements of the orthodoxy who actually don't want to serve in the army, which is really weird. Just keep breaking up the government. But we need to send thoughts, prayers, and non-State Department funds to the Democratic couch sitters, I think is what Liel is saying at the end of all of this. And remember, there's only one way to voice your democratic voice. It's not on the streets. It's not in protests. It's not through protected, freedom of speech. You got to sit down. You got to shut up. And you got to put your little vote in the box once every handful of years. Maybe never again if Bibi gets his way. But he won this last one. So we have no right to complain.
Fair enough.
The end. Also, not a single word about Palestinians in the entire article. Not one. Minor oversight. I don't know, maybe Compact thought they didn't want to go into the icky territory. They have an aversion to weird stuff, Compact magazine. So,
although again, I just want to point out, if you like very religious guys with beards, you do have other options. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.